Are you curious to know how you can integrate GPT functions inside of your Bubble app? In simple terms, GPT functions allow you to connect ChatGPT to data stored in external services. So for example, you could create a function between your own custom GPT as well as your Gmail account. This means that if you're ever talking to your GPT and you ask it to do something like draft an email, you could actually get it to then send that email to a particular person within your Gmail account. So you could say something like, hey, can you now send this email to Dave? And it would know exactly what to do.
Saves time and energy.
The way I think of GPT functions is that it's like creating your own real virtual assistant. So these things are super powerful. In our specific example today, we'll be using functions with the Google Books service. So based on our conversations that we have with our GPT model, we can then ask it to recommend specific books and it will return all of that information that it fetches from Google Books. Look, there's just so much that we need to cover. So what I'm going to do is hand this one over to Luca and he's going to walk you through all of the steps that you need to follow.
Hello everyone, today we're going to be working out how we can integrate GPT functions into our ChatGPT chatbots. The way to think about functions is that essentially allows the GPT to make an API call in certain given parameters based on the conversation that's going on within the chat. So for example, you could set up a function call that then gives you and pulls you the parameters to make the API call to say the Gmail API, and then you could create a chatbot that you could be chatting to someone and you could say, send this email to Mike about this topic, blah, 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 and it will just format and then send that email. In this example that we're going to be building out today, we're going to be integrating with the Google Books API. So when we ask for any information about a book, it's then going to intelligently drag the parameters out of our conversation to make the API call, and it's going to work out when exactly to do that intelligently as well. So if I say, hi, where is England, for example, it's going to give me just standard, chat GPT response. But then I'm like, hi, get me all the info. Give me all the info about the first Harry Potter book. And then I click send. You can see that it's now used the API call and the parameters has pulled the information. And we've got this functionality here. And as you can see, the good thing about functions, now we kind of built this before using kind of a workaround, but with functions, you can actually put in, I think it's up to 150 functions. So you could just have this massively capable chatbot that's able to do everything within any organization, as long as you obviously set up the functions correctly. Now, we're not going to go over exactly how to build the standard chat interface because we've done that in a previous video, which we'll link below. But we are going to work out how we can format the API call and build this functionality here. So if we, first of all, have a look at the API calls here. So what we've got is the standard completions API call. If we pull it up, which is the API call you would have been using to set up all your other chatbots, you can see pretty simple. We've just got the history, so the previous messages, GPT role and the GPT content, and then the user content. And each one of these blocks is basically a conversation entry for the chat. And then you put a bunch of them, and that's the history. You format that with a module input. You store the GPT content somewhere, maybe a repeating, maybe a custom state or in the database. And that's how that works. So the difference is that, as you can see, this is our functions enabled completions call. It's exactly the same thing, but then we've got this little additional bit called tools here. And then we've got tools function. So we can probably assume there's going to be more types of tools, but right now we've just got functions. And then this is where you essentially, what we're going to be learning today, how you can set the current parameters. So this is the get book function that we're going to be setting up. Some things to note, the name and the description actually gives the context of when the GPT is going to decide to pull the information and get those parameters for the API call that you then subsequently make on the back end. So you name it, you give a description, and then you list as many parameters as the API call that you're going to be using to set up from the function needs. So in this case, all I actually needed is the name of the book for our search on Google Books. But then I wanted it to also generate the message for the details of the book, which it just creates itself. So if we move to our design tab now, we can start building out that functionality. What we're going to be adding is this functions bit here. So if we go to the API reference, you can see this is the default chat completions API documentation, but you've actually got functions here. And you can see type function, name, get weather description, and then the different types of parameters. So basically, whenever you're going to be adding a new function, you're going to want to know what the API it's going to be calling to needs. And then you're going to want to obviously trial and error the name and the description so it is executing when you want it to. But let's actually go ahead and set this up. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a new API here. It's going to be OpenAI, private key in header. You can find your API key if you go to the dashboard, API keys. You can generate a new one like so, create API key, and you're going to want to copy and paste that into here. However you want to write bearer space and then your API key. I'm just going to go to here and cheat a little bit and copy this one that I've done earlier and paste it into here. And now we're ready to start creating our API call. So I'm going to call this API call completions functions. It's going to be post, and then we're going to be calling to the same endpoint here. So we can copy this, HTTPS completions. We're going to change this to post. We're going to get that in there. We actually need, if we actually look here, we need another shared header, which is the content type application JSON. So I'm just going to copy this, add a shared header. We're going to leave the content type and then paste in the application JSON. And now we're ready to actually set up the nitty gritty aspects of our call. So when we're actually writing the schema for the functions, which is this bit here, I've actually had a few issues with it before. It uses the quotation marks incorrectly for Bubble's application use. But if we actually go to getting started with GPT actions here, which is a great thing. You should always refer to the documentation if you get stuck. You can see that they've actually provided us with a public GPT that helps you write the schema for yourself. So if you click the GPT actions from this link, then it will get you to a GPT that will actually really help you and all the different things that you need and all the different parameters you need for that function to be successful. So you can see that it's creating you an action based off different documentation of different APIs, for example. So heavily use this for your GPT. So what we're going to actually do is we're going to go to our API reference for our completions. So previously, when we've set up the Bubbles completions API, what we've done is we've just copied the CURL of the API call, and then we're going to click import another call from CURL, hit paste and import. So as you can see, much like the other ones, again, it has done a lot of the formatting properly for us, except it's not actually given us all of the different bits and bobs, which is frustrating, but it has put in the endpoint and it's not really been that much helpful apart from that. So let's actually make sure that this is on post, which it is, and then let's name this call completions functions and turn it into an action. And then we can go back over here to API reference. We're going to want to grab everything after this D here because the H stands for header. So this is actually everything in the body. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to go back to our Bubble application and we're going to paste into here. So this is perfect. This is everything we need, except we're going to make a few different edits into this and then we're gonna be able to actually get this function working properly. So the first thing we're gonna do is actually put in the full completions call. So if you see on the API reference, if we go to default, it actually gives us the role of the API and its previous question, as well as the user's content. So we're going to copy this from the first curly bracket to the last curly bracket after the hello. So we're going to copy that. We're going to delete the first curly bracket and then Boston today. And then we're going to paste that in. And then we're also going to add history. So our chat has history. So if we do the greater than sign, type history, and then less than sign, you can see we can paste in our chat history here. We're gonna want to dynamically change the role of the GPT as well as the previous thing the GPT said. If we delete, make this helpful assistant, because that's going to confuse ourselves. So we're going to call this GPT underscore content. Perfect. We don't need to change the user because the user is already the user, but we do want to change what the user says. And so we're going to put in user underscore content here. So for the history, if we go to our API reference, we're just going to use a fake bit of history, which is just going to be this first example that OpenAI gave us here. Just need something to initialize the actual call itself. System, we'll keep it as the system message. If you don't know the difference, there's two types of GPT roles, and that is system and assistant. System is for the start of the conversation where you can kind of set the behavior, and then assistant is for everything in the subsequent conversation. So I'll just leave it as system for now. GPT content, you're a nice lad. And then for the user content, let's put Harry Potter and the order of the how do you spell that? Okay, so we're nearly ready to initialize, except we actually need to configure our function now. So as I said, if you're not actually going to be using the Google Books API, you're going to need to work out what all the different parameters you're going to be needing. And for each parameter, you want to set up a new property. So if you see, we've got properties here. Those are the things you're telling the GPT to define for your API call. The rest of this, as we said before, the name and the description is the scenario you want it to actually call the function. And then it says parameters, type, object, properties. That is just basically saying to the GPT that these are the things you should look for. And then as you can see, we've got one for the example, the location, type string, and then the description of what that is, the city, the state. And then we've got another parameter that is asking GPT to pull out of the conversation, which is the type. I've actually asked our GPT actions to explain it for us, for example. So string is a string of values. So it's usually text. So a text is a string of letters, punctuation, etc., etc. That's why I don't think with text you would want to have in that section string. And then you've got number, pretty self-explanatory. Boolean is yes or no. An array is a list, and then you've got object and stuff like that. But I would only worry about string, number, and Boolean. Those are the main things you're going to be encountering. Other common options. So as you can see in the first example, it's used enum is different to description. Description is where you're asking it to dynamically choose it based on the conversation. But if you use enum, you want it to only pick those few values. So this is just how you can make sure you're formatting the function correctly. And if we go to our API here, you can see we've got required, which is the things that need to be there for the GPT to actually execute the function. So for R1, we're going to use name and description. And then the last thing is tool choice. But yeah, essentially with tool choice, you can have auto or manual. You're deciding exactly, yes, we're going to execute every time. But for this video, we're going to leave it on auto. So what we're going to actually do is we're going to go in and edit this existing function. So our API that we're going to be using is the Google Books API. So if we scroll up here, it's a very simple API. You have to get authentication for it, but it's very simple. All you have to do is essentially in this Q parameter after we put in our private key afterwards, but basically after here you have your book name, but it has to be separated by plus icons, and we're dynamically changing that because we put the square brackets on here. So you can see it will always just be this book here, Man's Search for Meaning, but once we put the square brackets either side, we can now use that as a dynamic piece of data. So we basically, all we want is the book title in here, and then the other thing we want is actually to have the next message, so we can update or send a message along with the image that we're getting back from the API response. So we're going to go into our parameters here. We're going to change the name of the function. We're going to call it get book image underscore and underscore description. Has to be underscores between the different words, but the description we can give it any directive we want with spaces. So this should be called when the user is wanting to see slash, oh, let's not put slash because that might mess the code up, or wants to see info about a specific book you're both talking about. So this is where in this section, the description in between these two speech marks here is where you're gonna probably have to do a little bit of testing to actually get the instance where it executes correctly. So now we can go into our parameters here and we can actually rename this first parameter that we want. So we're going to turn this into the name of the book. So we're going to do name. We're going to keep it as string because it's going to be text. The description is the name of the book spoke about in convo. Now this one is going to be the description of the book that we're talking about in the conversation. So we're going to call this info. Again, it's going to be string, but instead of enum, I want to have another description. So I'm going to copy that and paste that into here. I'm going to get rid of the brackets, and then we can add another description here. So we're going to say a nice description, book, keeping in mind the previous messages in the convo. Perfect. Now we know we definitely want both the name of the book and the info about that book for the call to actually execute. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go in here, we're going to type in required name. It's about exactly the same as what you've set the parameter for here. And then we're going to do comma, another one of these, and then info. And then we're going to leave this as auto here. And now we should be ready to initialize the API. I'm just going to click include errors in the response and capture response headers. Then we're going to click initialize. Going to phrase the JSON body request. Okie doke. So after checking, what I think's gone wrong is we've not put a comma after our history. So if we reinitialize after that, we get the error again. So let's have another double check. And the last piece of error we made in setting this up is we want to get rid of these two apostrophes after the first and last curly brackets. Then we can hit initialize. And we've successfully set up our functions. So you can see, instead of a message content, we've actually got our message tools calls list instead that's come through, because we've said in our user content, a book title, you can see that it's come up with our functions arguments, Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, info, and then the info. So if we actually see the raw data at the bottom here, you can see that it is extracted in the argument section, which is like the outputs of the parameters from based on the conversation, the Order of the Phoenix here, and then we've got our description. So that is perfect. So now we're ready to set up our Google Books API. So if we go, so what we're going to want to do is type in the Google console, the Google Cloud Console. That is going to enable you to get access to the Google Books API. So you can see from the previous Google Books API tutorial we did, we set one up, but let's set another one up. What you're going to want to do is obviously create an account and get to the main welcome page of the Google Cloud Console. You're going to set up a new project. Call it Smart GPT. Hit create, and it creates a nice project for us. And once that's all done, which it just completed, we can now go onto this toggle here and click into our project, which we're in now. Then we can search in this top corner, Books API. It's the first one here, Google Books API. I'm going to click enable, and then it's going to load for us. Now we're going to want to go into credentials here to get our API key. We're going to click create credentials and then click API key. Then as you can see, we've got our API key here, which we can then copy. After that, we're going to want to go back onto our Smart GPT. We're going to want to go to Enabled APIs and Services, Google Books API. Then we've got our credentials here, which is our API key, metrics. But what we want to do is actually go to our documentation. But before that, let's actually store our API key so we don't lose it. So we're going to go add another API. Call this Google. Then we'll name our API call that we're going to set up the Books API get book. We'll just paste that in here for now. And then if we go back to Google, again, go into our documentation. This is where it's going to tell you all the different things you can actually get from the Google Books API. So as you can see, we can scroll down and then you can see we've got all of this information and all of the different API calls we can actually do. So you can search the volumes, volume ID, lots of different stuff. But we want to find the one that we can actually search for a specific title. But if we search all the way down into the using the API section, and if you want to command F and then type in flowers, then it will take you to the right section where we can actually get our API call. So you can see we've got our endpoint here, and then we've got our search term, and then we've got our authentication. This is called a self-authentication in the actual call, which can be a little bit unsafe if you're building this for scale. But for this use case, for learning functions, it works well. So we're going to want to copy this. We're going to go back to our Bubble application, back to our new Books API. I'm going to paste that before our API key. And as you can see, we've got, again, our endpoint, our search term here, but then we've got API key, and then we're going to still want to delete your API key, replace it with our API key, and now we want to do those square brackets so we can dynamically change that here. Perfect. So let's type in the one it's given us so we can initialize, and perfect, we get our response back. So as you can see, we can access a load of different information here. We've got our volume picture as a URL here, as well as descriptions, the publisher, the title, the description, etc., etc. So I'm going to want to save that now. And now we're ready to jump into our workflows here. If I quickly run you through what we have before resetting it up, this is the workflow for actually creating the chat functionality. So we're creating a new message at the start of our conversation, which is the one that we're sending into the chat. And then we have here in the GPT content, we have the last message that the GPT sent. Obviously in the first one, it's going to be empty. And then we're running our API call. And this is our functions enabled completions API call. So what the function actually spits out at the end of it is this piece of JSON with our argument. So for example, if we go to the call we've just set up and initialize, you can see that in the argument section, it's actually a piece of JSON. See, it's got the curly brackets, etc., etc. So we're actually going to need to extract that so we can use it in our message and in the API. And what I've done with that is actually get this read JSON get value key. So you just want to go to add plugins, type in JSON, and then there's quite a few. But if you scroll down, even read JSON, it should come up, and then you can click in school, and then we can use it in our workflows here. So you're going to want to download that plugin, and we'll go over all the subsequent bits after that. And then we're phrasing that into our API with a find and replace here. So we're replacing a space with a plus sign, and then that gets spat out, and then we're basically putting our message here, so the result of step 3, which is our message, as the content in our new message. So it sounds and looks quite scary at the moment. We've got all these only whens, etc., etc. But I will delete all of this, and then we can restart it and build it from scratch. So we have started building from scratch. I'm going to go over how to set up the actual UI of the chat in this video. But just to run through it very quickly, you've got a repeating group, and in one cell, you've got the user's message and the assistant's message. The repeating group is a list of messages. I've done it lazily here, and it's just all messages in the database for this tutorial. Obviously, you might want to create chats and nest them within chats. But essentially, when the current cell's message is the user's empty, then this appears, and this doesn't appear because this only appears when the current cell's message user is not empty, so when you sent it. After you've set up everything here, obviously this is the message content. If we look at our database, we've got a message, we've got the message content, the image, and JSON, and the user. But what we've got essentially is just a standard chat format, and then we've got a multi-line input and a icon that we can use as a button to start the workflow. So let's add a workflow here. So when we click that button, the first thing we want to do is create a new message. So if we create a new thing, that thing is going to be a message. We want to have its content, the JSON, and the user. So the content is going to be the multi-line input A's value, and the JSON is going to need to be a complete completions call. So I'm just going to go to the OpenAI documentation here. We go to chat, create completions, and then go into the default here where we can grab a full completion. So we copy that from the first curly bracket after this square bracket here until the next square bracket. So we're just going to copy that. And we're going to get rid of this expression by right clicking. Then I click in and just hit paste. Lovely. And this piece of JSON is essentially just for history. If you've done or created a chat functionality before, but this is just to create a history so your GPT remembers what's happened in previous conversations. We're just going to delete this and then insert some like data, insert some arbitrary text to make it a lot easier, and then we're going to do the same thing for the content of the user here. Except we're going to do multi-line input A's value. So we're basically just recreating the message, but in JSON format, so the GPT remembers what's going on. For the actual content, for this one, I'm just going to type in or insert some dynamic data, and we're going to search for the messages, sort by created date, sending no. That's just so the latest message comes up. We're going to add a constraint because we want that constraint to be user. We want this user to be empty because we want it to be the GPT and not yourself who's typing. So once we've got that, we're going to want to go back into our arbitrary text and then click the last item because we want the last message and we want its content. So that's just going to be the last message the GPT has sent. Obviously, using another method where you've got chats, you're going to do it slightly differently, but we're just going to use this way of doing it in this tutorial. So now we've set that up, we're going to add in the user as the current user because this message is coming from the user. And then we actually get to whack in our API. So we've got our completions equals functions API that we're going to put in here. And as you can see, we've got our dynamic fields to fill in. So to save us some time for the history, we're going to go back into our messages, back into this expression. We're going to copy it. We're going to paste it into here. But instead of being the last message content, we actually want to grab each item's JSON because we want all of the history every time we click a new message to be updated through the chat. So we're going to say assistant, and then we have our GPT content, so we can just insert some line data and just get our expression again without even editing it this time. And the user content is going to be the multi-line input A's value. Perfect. So the thing we're going to do after that to set up the chat functionality is actually create a new message. That message is going to be the message back from the GPT based off the output of the actual API call. So we're going to create a new thing. The thing's going to be message. Or in fact, let's copy this one, delete it, and then paste it again. So the content in this case is actually going to be the result of this step 2. So this is going to be the result of our API call here. So if we go to the result of step 2's choices, you can see this is where all our tool information resides, but we want the actual content for this one. And it's first item. So that's going to be response back from the chat GPT. Again, we can leave this all the same, except because this is going to be the reply from the chat, we want to leave the user empty because that's what we've got our conditional field on our chat as. I'm just going to delete all of the other messages in our database because it's going to make stuff slightly confusing. So as you can see, now we've got chat functionality working. Not sure really. Interesting, so it's given us an example. But if we go, what was my first message, we can test whether it's got memory, and it does indeed. It says that the first message was hi, and my first message was hi. So obviously we've got the standard chat functionality set up correctly now. So to set up the functionality, we want to be able to extract the data from that JSON output we get from the functions response. So using that plugin we got earlier, you can see we've got this read JSON and get value by key. So the JSON we're going to want to copy and paste this 2 times because you remember we've got the title and then we've got the description. So the JSON we're going to want to be extracting from is the result of steps 2 choices, but instead of going into content, we're going to be going into tool calls here and then functions arguments. And then I'm going to click last item because that's what's worked the best for me. And so it's going to be looking for that key, which is the name of the property that we've set up in our API call. So if we go down to our API call here, we've called one name and then we've called one info. So we're going to need to spell that exactly correct. So we're going to want to make a note of exactly what we've called the key for each property, even down to capitalized letters. So if we go to our workflow here, we're going to want to call the first one name. That's going to be the name of the book. We're going to copy it. We're going to paste it again. And then the last one we called was info. Perfect. So now we can actually grab those values and use them in our next API call, which is going to be to the Google Books API. So our Google Books API is Google get a book. As you can see, we've got our value here, and now all we have to do is insert some dynamic data, and we're searching for the book based off its name here. So we're going to want to grab this first one because that is the extracted JSON for our name parameter, and it's under string. So before we go in and add a load of conditions for when all of these are running, we're going to add another create message here. And that's because we want to create a message where the image from the result of this API call is put into our message. So we're going to want to copy this. I'm going to paste it here. And so what we want our content of this message to be is that description that we are getting back from this call here. So again, if we go into the result of step 2s, so what we want to do with this one is we want to actually have the content as the extracted description that the chat's given us from the function, which we called info here. So if we go into here, result of step 5 string, that's going to be our description. The previous message is going to be if we delete our arbitrary text here. And then we got to go into this bit in between these two speech marks here and insert some more dynamic data. We're going to go in. We again want the result of step 5 and it's string. And we want to keep the multi-line input as the multi-line input for the user. The last thing we want to add is our image, which we've set up in our database. If we go to messages, data types, image, type image, then we can add the result of the Google API. If we go into items, then if you type in link, you can see we've got this thumbnail, small, etc. I'm going to go small here. And it's going to be that URL that's going to be uploaded in the image. So now we've got that set up. One thing that we've forgotten to actually do is reset the user input. And now we're ready to add some conditional rules, because obviously when the function doesn't run, we don't want all these messages and all these things to happen. And for this API call to generate, we only want these three strings to happen. But when the function does call, we don't want this message to be created, but we do want all of these other things to happen. So what condition are we actually going to use to make that work? We're going to actually go into OpenAI's completions, and we're going to go into choices, and then we're going to go into the tool calls here. We know that when the function isn't called, there's not going to be any arguments, and so we're going to work based off that. So we're going to click arguments, and when the arguments, then we're going to go down to number of characters count is 0 or is not 0, so there are arguments, so the function has been called. That's the only scenario where we want that to happen, when the function's been called. So it is the result of step 2's completions, choices, the tool calls, function arguments, and then we've done number of characters count is not 0. So now we can copy that expression and paste that into all the different actions we only want to happen when that function is called. Perfect. But then we also want the reverse. So we always want this message to be created because that's going to be that user message that pops up for us. So we're going to leave that blank, and we're also going to leave the OpenAI functions blank. But we do want to make sure that this message with the response, which won't even be there because it's called a function, doesn't run. So we don't get a blank message in our chat. So we're going to paste in the exact same one, but we're going to change it to is not. So when it is 0, when the argument is 0, because there's no arguments because the function hasn't been called, that will run. So it will always run unless the function's been called. So if we preview our final application here, see we've got our previous messages. I want a book about a iron giant. And if we use step by step to make sure everything's working correctly, we'll create a new message, which is our message. We're running the completions here. We're creating that message, which means that it hasn't actually gone and got that image for us yet. And all the things that we didn't want to run aren't running, which is great. We scroll down, we've got no message back. Right, I'm going to go and delete all our messages for a second. Okay, so I did a little bit of tweaking. So we ran into a little hiccup there with the API, but everything should be sorted out from all the create a message parts of our workflows. If you put for the first one, for the current user, it's going to be the do a search for when the user is empty. Sorted by create date no. And it's like last item. So basically the last message that the AI sent content. And you want to do that for both messages. Sorry, you want to get rid of the arbitrary text for both messages. And then for the last two, for the message in which case the function runs, obviously you want both of these to be the result of steps 4's JSON. And for this one, you want the message content to be the output of the result of step 2's completion. So the completion content. That should get rid of any bugs. And then the last thing you want to format in this is with the get book API call, you want to add another operator, and that is going to be find and replace. And then you want to text define, just hit space and then replace with plus. And then once we preview our application, go, hi, can you help me with a book? Zero to 1 by Peter. Then bang. It's going to give you a book about startups, blah, 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 and then we get the image. So everything worked perfectly. So yeah, just on the last couple of bugs, it was basically the GPT content was arbitrary text, and it really was not liking that. So you want to make sure in all of those cases that it is just within, it is what we had within the arbitrary text is just the expression. And for the first message, it is that search for the last message content from the AI. In the case of when the function goes through, it is the result of step 4. And for the case of when the function is not gone through, it is just the message content first item of the first API call. So I hope you enjoyed that. As you can see, functions really introduce a whole host of different possibilities for your application. And yeah, hopefully this was relatively simple to go through. As I say, the main thing is kind of working out the syntax, and the rest of the bits, harder bits, was probably this JSON reader. But once you've got all that figured out and you can write all the different parameters you need, you can really, supercharge your GPTs. So that's been me for now, but thank you very much. And let us know what you're building in the comments. Cheers.
And just like that, you now know how to integrate GPT functions into your own no-code Bubble app. As you can see, GPT functions are super powerful, and it's just another way of taking your Bubble app to the next level. Look, if you found this video useful and you wanted to stay up to date with any additional Bubble resources we share, I'd always recommend hitting that subscribe button on our channel, so that way you can be the first to know whenever we drop a new tutorial. For now though, I just wanted to say a massive thank you for taking the time to watch this specific course, and I wish you all of the best on your own no-code journey.